welcome everyone. Thank you very much. It's a big pleasure to have you all here in the framework in Barcelona. Not the best day in Barcelona weather, but tomorrow it will be better. Don't worry. It's very good that we have the occasion to, in the framework of the joint project, to have an open but friendly discussion among the partners that have joined us here in Barcelona in the framework of the work package that CIDOB is leading on governance issues of EU foreign and security policy, and organizing this workshop then in the framework of this work package, but also opening up to the discussion to relevant academics and stakeholders and experts based in Barcelona who are also here with us today, to also broaden the discussions of the project. I mean, we will be speaking amongst ourselves, the members and the researchers involved in the joint project, but also aiming to widen a bit the discussion with other people who have very kindly agreed to attend to this seminar. As I was saying, for us it's a big pleasure to take part of joint. It's as CIDOB, we've been working on multiple Horizon 2020, even before that, Framework Program 7 and 6 projects, all of them with a strong component on EU foreign policy. But I believe that joint is really the project that speaks very much to our core expertise as well when it comes to EU foreign policy and when it comes to EU foreign policy against the global dynamics that are necessarily impacting but also conditioning to a certain extent the role that the EU can play in global affairs. So joint is very much about this. It's very much about taking stock of these global dynamics and how they are affecting the EU as a global actor, but also looking particularly at ways in which we can have more joint up architecture, more effective foreign policy, and also looking at the machinery of EU foreign policy and how it operates against these global changes that I was mentioning. With the ambition, and it can't be otherwise, at least from CIDOB, for a stronger Europe. And that is exactly also the project, what the project aims at. For us, as I was mentioning, and this is something that today is a very timely moment to discuss, we have a new government or the formation of a new government in Germany, also changing the narrative on strategic autonomy, or call it in different ways for the same thing, European sovereignty, many of the different languages that are being used to, at the end of the day, come up with more joint up and more effective EU foreign policy. So this is precisely what we are aiming to discuss today. It's not so much that we want to go deep only into the papers that will be produced in the framework of the joint project or that are being produced in the framework of the joint project, but also widen a bit the scope and try to make sense of the different both internal and external factors that are affecting EU foreign policy. Just for your information, we are recording this session, but we are recording it because after the session, it's not that it's being broadcasted now as we speak, but rather we will produce a video on the basis of the multiple things that will have been said here, and we will, in the framework of joint, of course, will issue a short video for dissemination purposes, right? And to make our best to increase the impact of joint. So for all those who don't know us, and I'm not sure that there are many, but still at CIDOB we have a very clear ambition to line up and jointly put together the global dynamic aspects that are setting the scene in the way that Europe, but also global politics is taking shape, and link it very much to local development. So to our understanding and all the research lines that we pursue, there is increasing evidence that everything happening at the global and European levels will eventually affect all levels of governance. And that is something that, compared to other think tanks that have more of a foreign policy perspective on things, we tend to also bring these discussions to the largest extent possible to local actors, to civil society in general, to all those people that will feel that anything that is happening beyond our traditional governance systems and more close-up governance systems will eventually be affected by these global and European dynamics. So this is what brings CIDOB more as a global affairs think tank rather than a foreign policy think tank. And I think that the discussions that we will be having today are very much in line with our with CIDOB as a think tank, as a long-standing think tank in international affairs. But without further ado, I will now just give the floor to the speakers. We will be having a first round of short remarks by the different speakers that are here in the program, and then we will try to open it up as much as possible and engage within the different things that have been said. And first and foremost, of course, Ricardo Alcaro as a long-standing colleague and friend of this institution, but also scientific coordinator of this project, will have the first word. You all know him, but he is a senior researcher at EI, Istituto d'Affari Internazionali, with whom we have a bilateral, long-standing agreement of cooperation and very fruitful so far. And so thank you very much, Ricardo. And then I will shift a bit the order that we have here, the alphabetic order, but all speakers have been warned in advance. So Ricardo, first floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Paul. I've got to say, this is just the second time I have been traveling for work since COVID struck us all last year. And it's really a pleasure that one of the first places I go to is CIDOB. I always come back with great pleasure here. It's indeed a very fruitful relationship, collaborative relationship we at the IAI in Rome have been having with you in these last years, and it's great that we are again involved in the development of an EU-funded project, a relatively big project, multinational, multi-year, and very ambitious in terms of its research objectives, this joint project which relates to the EU foreign and security policy, a concept which we understand in very broad terms. We understand by it not just the formalized procedures according to which the EU as an organization produces foreign and security policy, so the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy, but also a number of other actions taken by the EU as an institution that have external relevance. And on the top of that, we have come to the conclusion that it is not possible to speak of EU foreign and security policy unless we also insert into the discussion the national foreign and security policies of member states, especially when this foreign policy carried out by member states works in parallel to the EU foreign and security policy, and therefore strengthens or complements it. But before we delve into the actual contents of EU foreign and security policy, it is perhaps better to start with a few words about what we understand as what we understand when we speak of the EU as as a foreign and security policy actor, or as an actor itself. Clearly, the EU is, as a foreign and security policy player, is changing its nature, is adapting to a different reality. But there have been some constants that will remain so even in the future. And the most important one is, in my opinion, to understand what the nature of the EU as an actor is, because it is a nature which is very different from the nature of a sovereign state. especially when sovereign states are understood as international units. So units acting on the international scene. The EU is not a sovereign state and therefore cannot act as a sovereign state. The EU is a collective actor. Or you can even go as far as to frame the EU as a foreign security policy collective or multi-actor system. Because you have a number of actors different in nature, so EU institutions and EU member states. So there is a difference of quantity, there is an element of quantity, the fact that there are a number of these actors, 27 member states plus the institutions, and there is a qualitative difference, EU institutions and member states. And borrowing the phrase from the Animal Farm, not all member states are actually equal to one another. So what kind of an actor is the EU in foreign and security policy terms? Well, it really varies depending on, first, the issue area or the policy area. The EU can be quite an influential actor, or the EU is at times quite a non-influential, ineffective actor. So, and I guess the first thing we have to look into to determine, to ascertain the amount of, or the potential for effective action by the EU is where the policy-making process, which eventually results in a foreign and security policy action, takes shapes. And this process is basically the result of a negotiation, bargaining, adaptation process by the member states and between the member states and the institutions. So, for instance, in trade, you have this kind of negotiation, this policy-making process happening mostly at the beginning of the process, or at least the negotiation between the member states happens at the beginning of the process. Then the member states give EU institutions full power to execute that position, to develop an action based on that position, and that usually results in an impactful outcome. So the EU in trade, for instance, is quite an influential actor internationally. The things stand quite differently when it comes to crisis management, for instance, because in that regard, member states do not engage in significant, or most of the time, do not engage in meaningful bargaining and negotiating processes before actually taking action. They first take action depending on the intensity of the interest they have in a specific situation of crisis or a specific situation of conflict, and then try to project their own actions, their own narratives, their own positions onto the EU level, and that usually creates frictions with other member states and stalemate or a common denominator-based position at the EU level. And today's internal and external environment is not exactly conducive to making these negotiating and bargaining processes easier. Actually, they make it harder. In the joint process, we have identified three main context factors that make the process of developing more joined up actions by the EU, understood as both the institutions and the member states, harder to achieve. These context factors are the emerging and increasing multipolar competition, and that obviously relates to the fact that great power competition and power politics are getting back, are becoming again very much relevant, perhaps the most relevant element shaping international relations. A second factor is concerns the fact that regions, most notably regions surrounding the EU external borders, have become increasingly fragmented, and that creates a problem of complexity, first in understanding the situation, then sorting out the priorities, and then putting together a multifaceted response that span across different policy areas, that involves different foreign policy actors at the EU level, and this is really, really difficult to achieve, at times perhaps even impossible. And the third context factor is internal, in the sense that intra-EU disagreements, which of course have always been a natural aspect of EU foreign policy making, are widening, and at times they are politicized, instrumentalized for reasons of for domestic political expediency, to the point that at times they descend into outright contestation, not just of an EU action, but of the EU itself. Especially the first element I mentioned, multipolar competition, and the fact that, but also the second, because the fact that so much instability around the EU is gradually, increasingly spilling over into the EU itself, has created a demand in the EU for the European Union to act, to become one of the poles around which this multipolar international reality revolves. And this again has created a number of different reactions, not all of them enthusiastic, within the member states. There are some member states who are more in favor of this view of Europe as a geopolitical actor in the making, and others who are relatively uncomfortable with that. The reality, however, is that the EU is not very well equipped to be a geopolitical power. The EU is, after all, a multilateral institution. It's the multilateral institution par excellence, because it is not just a framework organization, it is an action organization capable of setting goals and pursuing those goals and taking common actions, although not always, of course. So we get to sort of a stalemate or a paradox, if you wish. Because on the one hand, the EU is called for, even by some of its most important member states, most notably France, to become a geopolitical player. The Commission President von der Leyen has herself said that she wants her own commission to be a geopolitical commission. But on the other hand, the EU is not, does not possess all the power assets you actually need if you want to act geopolitically internationally. On the other hand, the EU, while being a weak geopolitical actor per se, is an amplifier of national influence. All member states, to different degrees, granted, but all member states, none excluded, including the UK, which is no longer a member state, gets a degree of amplification of their international influence thanks to the EU. The problem is that with, when you factor in those context factors I mentioned between multipolar competition, regional fragmentation, and intra-EU divisions, you get to a situation in which the member states do look at the EU as a potential amplifier of their foreign policy and international action, but based on their understanding of what their national interests are. So to make an example, Germany is a massive trade power, and borrowing the phrase from former US President Trump, Germany does to an extent see the EU also as a vehicle for expanding its already massive trade power. So Germany is in itself a trade power. Thanks to the EU, is a global trade power, one of the most influential ones. France, on the contrary, tends to look at the EU also as a platform that can amplify its capacity to project military power abroad, for instance, into the Sahel. And this process plays out at all levels among all member states. So we are in a situation in which we will need to see whether it is actually possible to reconcile the EU as a collective, multilateralist, partly supranational instrument which, by the way, can only thrive within a broader international rules-based system with the specific national priorities and interests of individual member states which do not want to distance themselves from the EU because they need the EU to be as influential as they are and to become even more influential than they are now, but at the same time, they do not want that process to be equal to sacrificing some part, at least, of the national agenda. So is this possible? I think it is possible, but there is not a single answer. It has to be a differentiated analytical answer and political answer, a number of different bargains, a number of differently negotiated solutions, because at the end of the day, the EU cannot produce a truly geopolitical foreign and security policy. What it can do is to make that foreign policy or foreign policies more joined up, and this is eventually what we set out to doing when we started this project a few months ago.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. I mean, excellent framing of not only the ambition of the project, but also linking it very much to relevant issues of discussion. Let's keep it here for the moment. I'll turn to my left now to Christy Reich, who's director at the International Centre for Defence and Security, another partner, very important partner of the project. So, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's always great to be in Barcelona. It's several years since I last visited CIDOB, so it's good to be back. And coming from Tallinn, I can assure you the weather is great here. Ricardo made indeed a very good introduction and framing many of the issues that I was also going to raise. So perhaps I can highlight some more specific points in my remarks. And I would actually like to start from this concept of normative power, which you emphasize in the description of this seminar today. And it's a concept I have worked on, and very many researchers who have worked on EU foreign policy have been studying that and applying the concept. But now that we are in a changing framework of multipolar competition and return of power politics, I think this is really a time to rethink what is kind of left of this concept of normative power, or how is it doing in today's world. And my point here is that the EU is currently on the defensive when it comes to values and norms. And this is quite different from the post-Cold War era, which is over, but that was the time when EU foreign and security policy was developing fast and was doing so in a very favorable international environment where our understanding about international norms and about democratic values and human rights and so on was without any really serious challengers. And so the EU could develop this idea of itself as an international actor, kind of focusing on promoting the good norms and values that we thought everyone shares the understanding that they are good. And looking around us today, we see quite a different environment. There has been a decline of democracy in the world for many years, according to some studies for 15 years in a row. But what is specifically worrying in recent years is that there is erosion of democracy in some European Union member states and also in some old democracies, including the US. So this is really a very different context for speaking about promoting our values or applying normative power. And I think we need to, in the EU, kind of think much more about protection of our values, and also kind of think deeply about what is important and why these values are important for us. What we see also in some Western countries is that people's belief in democracy being a preferable system is becoming questioned. So this idea that a democratic system and liberal values have some intrinsic value and people want to live free, it's not so taken for granted. I may still believe that I prefer to live in a democracy rather than an autocracy, and I actually remember from my childhood living in a totalitarian system. I don't want back there. But we see that there are people in the West who feel disillusioned, people in my society, in your society. So we need to think about the ability of our systems to deliver and not just to kind of continue with this slogan that our values are the best and good for everyone. So it's a need for protection and kind of defending the values if we still believe that they are worth defending. And this value dimension is an important part of the great power competition. And also the great power competition is taking place when it comes to international norms in different areas, be it security, be it trade, be it technology, cyber, digital sector. In all these areas, we see authoritarian powers promoting a different set of norms. It's not necessarily that they want to have no norms-based order, but at least they want to have an order based on different kinds of norms. And it can be about very kind of key principles, for example, talking about European security. Do great powers have the right to a privileged sphere of interest? Or do they treat all countries as sovereign in an equal manner or not? Right now we are seeing this question very acutely in discussions around Ukraine, which has become hot again. So that was about the values and norms. And my second main issue or point that I wish to highlight is the aspect of hard power. And that's something the EU has kind of felt uneasy about, and we have long had these discussions among researchers about whether the EU can be somehow different kind of actor that does not even want to develop harder forms of power, or that can somehow be unique and normative without resorting to force. But I'm afraid the global context is kind of pushing Europeans to focus more on also defending our harder instruments of power and kind of giving up this idea of uniqueness. And at the same time, I fully agree with what Ricardo was saying about the EU as a collective actor not being capable of kind of traditional geopolitics. And it really has limitations when it comes to developing all aspects of hard power. But it's just something that is needed to defend the European values and norms and interests. Sometimes you need hard power to do it. And myself coming from the northeastern corner of Europe, we are acutely aware of the importance of credible defense and deterrence. And while kind of the division between hard and soft power has become more blurred in the past years, and we see this kind of hard contestation of power moving more to the field of cyber and technology, it doesn't happen kind of at the cost of relevance of military hard power. So that's also still relevant. And the EU is weak, whether we talk about military capabilities or cyber capabilities, intelligence, other forms of kind of harder power that we would need to actually be able to take more responsibility for European security. And also coming from the Baltic Sea region, I have to mention the importance of the transatlantic relationship, which is not as important for all EU member states. But for our region, it's just so evident that the US contribution is indispensable for our regional security for a long time to come. And so when we talk about what the European Union can contribute to security in our region, it really has to be kind of complementary, and we need to look at this broad framework of Euro-Atlantic security. And it's very important that Europeans strengthen their capability and take more responsibility for their security, but it cannot happen at the cost of the transatlantic relationship. Of course, we may also end up one day in a situation where we don't have the choice as Europeans to maintain the strong transatlantic relationship, but maybe the choice will be made by somebody else to actually make some radical changes to that. And we have been through the Trump presidency, and we might be looking forward to another one. And very final point, I kind of echo what Ricardo was saying about the importance of member states. And I think that is very important, or a key issue. And unfortunately, we have seen in the past years that building political unity in the EU on various issues, including foreign policy, it has become even more difficult, and building solidarity and trust among member states. But there is just no other option than to keep on trying, and it's good to have this forum where we can discuss perspectives from different parts of Europe and try to find the common ground, and also to think of ways to make the EU as an international actor more relevant for member states. Because for member states, the EU is often not the kind of primary framework, and especially when it comes to security and defense, it's often not the primary framework of cooperation. So there is a lot of space to further kind of building this European unity and solidarity through, I think, actions and debates and very concrete commitments. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you very much. I forgot to say sorry at the beginning that unfortunately Christina Kausch, who was also in the panel, unfortunately is not able to join us. But now I'll move again to my right to Pernille Rieker, who's a research professor at NUPI. So very good to have you as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. For me, it's also, if not the first travel after COVID, it's the second. The first was to Italy. and so it's really great to be here. And like for Christy coming from Oslo, where it's already winter is coming, it's very nice to be here. So I will start a little bit in the same way as you, Christy, talking about the EU as a normative power. I will try to respond to the question in the introduction where you ask, is there a need for a joined-up and strategic union to become a normative power? And I will start by arguing that the key role of the EU as a global power must, of course, still be to promote democracy, respect for liberal norms, multilateralism, which is now increasingly under pressure all over the world and even within the Union itself. But at the same time, in the current geopolitical context, the EU also has to become an actor that is both willing and capable to, as Christy also said, protect both the Union and its citizens' way of life and its values, both from internal and external threats. So to my mind, being a joined-up and strategic union is not really a contradiction to being a normative power, or at least having a foreign policy based on values, which I prefer because I'm not so sure if the EU really is a normative power, but at least that it aims at having a foreign policy based on these values. And rather than being more joined up, it's rather being a normative power or having a foreign policy based on values is to some extent, being joined up is a necessary condition to be a credible normative power. So the question is how this will be done, and I will come back to that a little bit later. The main challenge for the EU is not really handling the external crisis, which is, of course, huge as well. But I think the main challenge is actually the main challenge is not really to pursue this normative agenda, it's rather the fact that certain member states now openly challenge these values, and that the EU do not really have any effective instruments to sanction them. And if this continues, it could potentially undermine the whole project, or at least make the EU promotion of norms externally far less credible. So this could undermine the whole idea of having a normative foreign policy. But said that, in spite of this challenge that I think should not be undermined or underestimated, it is important to recognize also that the EU has proven to be far stronger as an actor than many would have expected a few decades ago. In the end, the EU has survived and even come stronger out of a period where it has been faced with multiple external crises. And for the field of foreign and security policy, this constant crisis management operandi at the level of the EU for the past 2 decades or so has led to a shift where the EU members have agreed to reorient the EU in a more strategic direction, becoming perhaps more active and less reactive, and without compromising too much on its normative basis, at least for now. So this is how I understand the various concepts that the EU itself used to guide its foreign policy. Either it is principled pragmatism, or strategic autonomy, or geopolitical commission. All these concepts have been heavily criticized, but I think they could be, in my view, they could be understood as necessary adjustments to a new geopolitical context and the many experiences that the EU has had of crisis management over the past decades. And this is basically what principled pragmatism is all about, rather than a contradiction in terms like some have argued. But also the concept of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty could also be interpreted as a necessary move to make sure that the EU will be able to protect its interests, its security, as well as its values and way of life. And this is crucial and not necessarily a risk of undermining the transatlantic relations as I see it, because the EU needs to be stronger, or Europe needs to be stronger, also in case the US is not willing or able to assist. And this refers to more, this concept refers to far more than only defense, it's security more broadly. And last but not least, I think the ambition of President von der Leyen to create a geopolitical commission is perhaps the most interesting, like Ricardo also mentioned. In my view, it's the most interesting because it recognizes a key aspect of the EU as a global power that for too long have been neglected, at least by the EU itself, or undercommunicated. In the academic literature, of course, it has been studied, the union's regulatory power, or more recently also the Brussels effect, the book by Anna Bradford. And this has been an important mechanism, and a mechanism that probably from now on will be used also more strategically. And I think with the Green Deal, which is both an internal policy but with external implications, will be a way of making the EU as a global power, as a global regulatory power, and I think this should not be underestimated. My final point concerns how the EU can become more joined up in its more traditional foreign and security and defense policy. And there should, of course, be an ambition to strive for greater unity, more rapid decision-making procedures and common action. But we also know that this takes a lot of time. and especially because these areas are dominated by unanimity. So this is why I think there should be more pragmatism with regards to what counts as various European foreign security and defense policy initiatives, as long as they are in Europe's interest as a whole and based on the core values. Because in the end, progress is more important than procedures and institutions. And in the end, this is not so radical. I mean, if you look at the history of European integration, most of the most ambitious initiatives have actually started outside the treaties, and then maybe among a few member states, and then be introduced into the treaty at a later stage. Schengen is an example. Saint-Malo is an example that actually speeded up the process through ESDP and now CSDP, which was integrated into the treaties. But over the past decade or so, we have a range of bilateral cooperation. Of course, the main cooperation is the French-German cooperation, but we also have unilateral initiatives that Ricardo has been written about, the E3 on Iran, the EII, the European Intervention Initiative that France has initiated, and we have various unilateral defense arrangements of different kinds. And in my mind, this should be seen and recognized as integrated part of a broader European integration process that becomes increasingly differentiated, but not necessarily more fragmented. So to conclude, in the current context, I think this is actually the only way forward. And in my mind, this will not undermine the EU, rather on the contrary. In the end, in the EU context, I think too much time is wasted on debating and quarreling about the concepts and procedures, and too little on finding ways to actually solve conflicts and crises as they occur. So the real threat to the EU as an actor is coming rather from the member states internally that do not comply with the values and rules, of course, but also the member states that constantly kind of are against these processes that they see as undermining the EU or undermining transatlantic relations and so on. I think that we should have a broader look at how strengthening European defense will not undermine NATO. It was actually strengthen NATO and strengthen European security and defense. So a little bit more open discussion. I think we see a trend towards a more broader conceptualization of what European foreign and security policy is all about. And my participation in the project, I hope that I can contribute with some ideas in that direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pernilla. We all do. We all really hope that we that we manage to do so in the framework of this project. Go back to my left and now to Adam Holesh, who's a research fellow at eBay. eBay is a sister organization here based in Barcelona. We also have a long-standing relationship between CIDOB and eBay, and they are also part of projects that were funded under the same lines that Joint is funded and also does sister projects. So it's very good to have you here, Adam. Give you the floor now, and then we continue with our joint partners.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm invited here in my position as project manager of GLOBE. It's another H2020 project, right? We are already in the 4th year, and as the Commission always want us to interact and overlap. So I was thinking, what can I present here, right? Which is the biggest overlap between our two projects. And because usually the talks on foreign security policy, are very theoretical, I was thinking to bring some data. So allow me to present some data, something which we found out in our project, and which can be, I hope, at least helpful here. I have also another member of GLOBE, Levin, who's also there, so we are already two here. He can support me maybe later in the discussion. So first, let me start with what we found out about the state of global governance nowadays. Okay, so the state of art was global governance is dynamic and very complex, and is becoming every year more complex, right? Due to the growing number of actors, non-state actors, and every time more informal organizations. The complexity is also due to external factors like the rise of multipolarity, no? And also the rise of nationalism. We have seen it above all under not the Trump government in the US, how strong it can influence global governance and some strong institutions, as for example the WTO. But also sociological research shows but global governance institutions are successful when there is a fit between the structure of the institution, of the organization, and the external environment. Okay? But because many international organizations have been founded decades ago, and the international environment changed, right? Right now we have something like a mismatch. Okay? This is a very important reason why global governance is not working so well nowadays. Okay, we also identified 3 big problems for IOs, right? The first one are the different preferences of the member states. We have very huge IOs with many members with different preferences. Then limited mandates of these IOs, and the lack of funding. Okay, so the IOs want to do a lot of stuff, but sometimes the member states of these IOs doesn't allow. So let me come to the second point, and this is the main point of my presentation today, is the role of European Union in this global governance, right? Which is complex, complicated, which has many problems. So we have 2 camps of authors, researchers. The one camp is saying that the EU remains below its possibilities, but it could be stronger, but it has many problems due to this permanent European Union crisis, okay, which started already in the 2010s, and we go on. Also due to the conflicting member state preferences, okay, that the EU could make more. But there are other authors, and Bradford was mentioned here before, right, who's saying that the European Union is a regulatory superpower, no? With a very strong trade regime, and is also have a very positive image due to the promotion of human rights. Okay, so these are the 2 camps. There is also another one which is more neutral, right? But let us check how is this in reality. Okay, and here comes, I would like to introduce our data set, okay, on our authority of international organizations. And here in this data set, we've defined global governance as the exercise of authority beyond the nation state, okay? And the authority in the IOs relies on 2 factors. 1, an IO must act with a certain degree of autonomy from its member state. And 2, to exercise authority, IOs should be able to also bind states to a particular course of action. Okay, so here we have 2 factors, autonomy and bindingness. And let me start directly with the finding. We found that the European Union is also not only the most authoritative international organization, but it also likes to participate in the most authoritative international organizations. So the image of the European Union on the global stage is, okay, maybe it doesn't do enough. We found out that if there is a place to do something, it goes there and it's present. Okay, let me explain these results in detail. So why is the European Union the most authoritative IO? We have a scale from 0 to 1, no? And the European Union scores with 0.7, okay? Many of that has to do with the expanded mandate and competences after the Lisbon Treaty. No, it's around 40% more. Okay, if you're interested in this data, the other authoritative IOs, which are close to the European Union, is the International Monetary Fund with 0.68, United Nations with 0.6, and the World Bank with 0.5. Okay, but when we see the score of the European Union and that it's the most authoritative IO, we see that it possesses the capacity, okay, to act on the global area, which I think is a very important finding. Okay, then we distinguish also between sectorial IOs, okay, and we also look here which are the most authoritative. and we distinguish between multi-issue, economy, security, and human rights. Okay, and here the most authoritative IOs now are in the field of multi-issue. Okay, then the economic, then security, and then human rights. Okay, a multi-issue with 0.3, economy 0.25, security 0.2, and human rights very low, 0.08. Okay, so how, let's come to the last point. How does the European Union participate in this sectoral international organization? Okay, and we see that it is 100% present in all multi-issue IOs. Okay, it's present everywhere. However, usually as an observer. Okay, let me maybe give a definition more. So the participation we measure with 4 factors: full member, observer, delegation, or no participation. Okay, so here it says usually observer. Sometimes it cannot become a full member because, as Ricardo said, no, there is a special nature of the European Union. It's not a state. It cannot become a full member. In security IOs, it is present in 86% of the security IOs, okay, but usually in its lowest status, only as a delegation, okay, and here we see it doesn't have the competences to be more. It would like to be more, but it cannot. Okay, it's also present in 50% of the economic IOs, but here mostly if it's present as a full member. Okay, and here the explanation is now what's also so well explained in the book on the Brussels effect: trade, single market, strong, right? The interest now to be there, and also the organizations are interested to have the European Union there as a full member. Okay, this is also very important. And maybe which is one of the most important findings, it is present in 24% of the human rights IOs. But if it's present in 50% of these IOs, it is present as a full member. Okay, so here we have some very interesting finding. No? It acts, right, inside its own structures, no? Following the human rights. It wants to be an active promoter of human rights, right? However, the Commission doesn't have any competences in this field, but if it can join an international organization, right, it takes it to the extreme, right, and it wants to become a full member. Okay, these are the preliminary findings. Maybe we can talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you also for bringing complementarity to our discussions and particularly along the lines of well-developed research lines at DBA on international organizations and contestation of international organizations and the role of the EU. Back to my right, Zachary Paikin, who's a researcher at CEPS. The floor is yours.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much, Mr. Morias and Paul, also for the invitation to be with you today. It's not my first time in Barcelona, but I believe it is my first time here at CIDOB, so it's a real pleasure to be here, and I hope it's the first of many times to come, and it's also my first international trip since the beginning of the pandemic as well, so I'm quite happy, having been confined to Canada for the past 21 months, finally to be back in Europe. So I was asked by Paul to speak a little bit about what kind of actor the European Union is becoming in a shifting international order. And I think in order to answer that question, it's important to have a discussion first, if you'll permit me, on the nature of the evolving international order right now. I contend that we are currently entering what is, in effect, the first truly global international order that modern history has seen. And I don't think that that is a fact that is mentioned often enough and that is appreciated often enough. In the 19th century, we had a center-periphery structure in the international order. There was an imperial core and a colonial center. And so while it was an international order of global scope in geographic terms, it wasn't a truly global international order per se, because there were first-class actors and there were second-class actors. In the Cold War, we had, in effect, two separate, contained international orders rather than a single order of global scope, even though there were elements, of course, there were international organizations like the United Nations, etc. but by and large, you did have two separate spheres. And so what we saw at the end of the Cold War was an attempt by the United States to create, in effect, the first ever liberal world order at a time when the first ever global order was actually emerging. And so, you know, and I think this is the case because, you know, you can go back to Wilsonian idealism in the interwar period. This was a very thin international order with the League of Nations, and therefore not truly, you know, a fully fledged form of liberal internationalism. John Eikenberry calls it liberal internationalism 0.5 rather than 1.0. And then, of course, during the Cold War, the liberal international order was to a large extent bounded geographically and limited to the Western Bloc. And so in 1990-91, you have really for the first time the attempt to craft a liberal world order of global scope. And that project, over the course of the past decade, it has become increasingly evident that that project has failed. And what is emerging now, slowly and very messily, is in effect the world's first truly global international order. Now, next question, when we talk about order versus disorder, okay, how do you order the world's first truly global international order? Right, so let's go through some of the, you know, different possibilities that have, you know, been used throughout modern history, right? So can you have a singular hegemony? Can you have one power that dominates the entire international system? Well, no. As I just said, the United States may be the most powerful country in the world, but it is not powerful enough to dominate all the other powers in the world itself and to impose order on its terms and its terms alone. Another possibility is you could have a great power concert. For example, you know, like the Concert of Europe in the 19th century, and I'm sure many of you read that article in Foreign Affairs a few months ago by Charlie Kupchan and Richard Haas, indeed from CFR. Now, they make some compelling arguments, but the fact is that great powers, in relative terms, while they don't get along a lot, when they don't get along, it can cause a lot of disorder, as we're seeing. That doesn't mean that together the great powers can impose order on the rest of the international system today. In relative terms, they are weaker today than they were in the 19th century international system. Right? There are other actors that are capable of resisting the influence of the great powers, have a much more robust form of sovereignty, middle powers, etc. Now, ironically, because we talk about the dissolution of sovereignty, the disintegration of sovereignty thanks to international integration. But in reality, the way to look at it, I think, is that there's a much more robust form of sovereignty and ability to resist the great powers, which leads to my sort of third possibility, which is, okay, you can have spheres of influence, right, which is another theoretical way of ordering the international system by definition. Well, can that happen? Probably not. We can't imagine that the world's first truly global order can disintegrate again into sub-orders that are entirely separate from one another. The world is too integrated right now, and again, you know, third powers, third parties don't want to choose necessarily to be in one sphere of influence or in another sphere of influence. So that's out. So, you know, now we go to the sort of final option, which is the so-called rules-based international order, which is the EU's preferred option. And we sort of make reference to this term all the time, the rules-based international order, and the need to defend the rules-based international order. But, you know, that avoids the question of, first of all, what rules? You know, are we just talking about, you know, international law? You know, what's the difference between the rules-based international order and international law? Why don't we just say international law, as far as I'm concerned? That it's not just a question of what rules, it's also a question of whose rules and who gets to write the rules. And that question is not verily resolved by simply saying we need to defend the rules-based international order. So going beyond this, we're entering into a new period of history, and within the rules-based order that we've been accustomed to, there is a decoupling that is occurring right now, and I think this goes back to a little bit of what Christy was saying before, but I might put a little bit of a different spin on it. Which is that there really were two components to this international order. There was the liberal component, the liberal international order, and then the rules-based multilateralist component. And we like to think of these two things as being, you know, impossible to separate one from the other, right? If you read international relations theory and you talk about liberal internationalism, you know, what does it talk about in IR 101? It says, you know, it's based on international institutions and rules-based cooperation, etc. So these concepts are very mixed up in our minds. But what I think we're seeing, to a certain extent, is a decoupling of the liberal from the rules-based. And we can choose to pursue the liberal. And if we pursue the liberal, then that invites, by definition, permanent contestation with those illiberal countries in the international system, such as Russia and China. Or we can choose to emphasize the rules-based element. But again, that goes back to the question of whose rules and what rules, which are unavoidable, as far as I'm concerned. And that, I think there's a parallel there as well, by the way, between the domestic decoupling of liberalism from democracy, which again, we assume that in the West, we're liberal democracies, they go naturally together. But, what we're seeing these days are a bunch of undemocratic liberals who are basically the technocrats who run the show and who think that elections are basically just a nuisance. And at the end of the day, they're going to continue on governing according to the policies that they think are correct one way or another. And then you've got illiberal Democrats, right, which are the populists who command a significant amount of democratic support in many different countries, right? So there's an interesting parallel there. So we're at a time of decoupling, and I think we're at a time of creation, as I said, the creation of the first global order. And so we're not at a time of order transition. I think that's an important thing to mention. It's a time of order decoupling and order creation, rather than order transition, which is something that would occur within a single, culturally homogenous international order like we saw throughout modern history when the hegemon changed. We're not just going through a period of a changing hegemon. I think there's a much more fundamental change that's occurring right now. And I'll add one more point before getting into sort of the role of the European Union to conclude with. Which is that it's not merely multipolarity that we're living in today as well, because again, this refers to within a single international system of some degree of cultural homogeneity. I know that realism likes to think that it's blind to the question of culture, but I think we need to go a little bit beyond that and to say that we're in an era of normative contestation as well, and not just multipolarity. And so strictly defined, of course, multipolarity is only in the material sense. But if you expand the definition and don't necessarily associate it with the realist school of thought, then yes, you can talk about a form of multipolarity that captures what we have today. Right, so what does this mean? First of all, if we're going beyond multipolarity in the more traditional sense of the term, right, and we're entering a new era of sorts, right, then talking about becoming a more joined-up actor and a pole in the international system, a pole in a multipolar world, doesn't necessarily capture everything of the entirety of the goal, or the task rather, that faces the European Union today, right? There's a goal of trying to find a way to imbue a novel international order context with a form of order, with a form of stability, with a form of resilience. And I don't necessarily know if we have the concepts to do that yet, right? We talk all the time about, yes, we need more rules-based cooperation, we need more multilateralism, we need more respect for liberal democracy and human rights, we need more respect for sovereignty, as other powers might say, but those are, to a certain extent, modern concepts. And I don't know if we've developed necessarily the concepts necessary or required to provide a degree of order in today's emerging international order. And I think that proves that there's still a great amount of conceptual work still to be done today on that front. So the role of the EU within this, I would say, is to play a role, seeing as we're at an era of creation today rather than an era of transition. The role of the European Union is to play a role in that creation, to understand that we're at that period of creation, right? Not to play a role in defending the existing order, an order which, in any event is moving along, or may already be relegated to a certain extent, not entirely, but to a certain extent in the dustbin of history, but to play a role in that creation, on the side of creation, and then on the side of the decoupling, which I mentioned, you have to find a way to manage that decoupling in a way that is responsible. Right, and so, rather than reverse it, because it's a likely irreversible form of decoupling that we're living through right now. So, doing the opposite of that, right, trying to reverse the form of decoupling that we're undergoing right now between liberalism and the rules-based order, trying to, defend rather than participate in creation, well, that's only going to lead by definition to more contestation on the world stage. It's going to lead to more contestation within the European Union, because a lot of that concerns the relationship between liberalism and rules-based practices as well. And so you can't resolve this crisis without situating yourself in the international order that we find ourselves in, and in the intellectual and ideological climate in which we find ourselves in today. So just as the EU has itself been a rules-based order situated within a wider rules-based order in previous decades, the way to move forward, I would think, is to find some way for the EU to enmesh itself in a way that it resembles the emerging international order. And that's what needs to be thought about right now. And I'm grateful for any suggestions or reflections that any of you may have on that front. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachary, and also thought-provoking. So thanks very much for that. And last but not least, let me turn to Paul Varghese, who's a research fellow here at CIDOB, also working on work package 3 that we lead. So our lead researcher for joint. All yours, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I would like to talk about a concrete policy, which is the Strategic Compass for Security and Defense, that a draft has been published this November, and it has been created by the External Action Service, and now it will be passed on to the member states that need to discuss it and decide. My argument is going to be to follow on what Pernille has said, that it's not only member states that sometimes challenge the EU as a normative power, but it's sometimes the EU itself that challenges its normative power. So the Strategic Compass for Security and Defense, for those who do not know, is a strategic document that provides a joint assessment of the threats and challenges Europeans face and tries to propose policy guidelines to the European Union. This joint assessment is important because, as Borrell repetitively says, not all member states perceive threats in the same way. And he uses an example repetitively that Baltic states, for instance, perceive Russia to be the biggest threat, but for Portugal or Spain is less a direct threat. And Spain is preoccupied by the migration coming from Morocco. Poland is preoccupied by migration coming from Belarus. So there is a different perception on what is a threat, or what is a risk, and what should be done. And that's why the strategic compass, it's useful. However, what caught my attention while reading this document was the language used in the strategic compass. It is a very bold language, aggressive, combative. It's a bit frightening. Some would say that it's a bit delusional. Europe needs to be protected against everything. And Borrell was in an interview for a Spanish newspaper on Sunday, and the headline was, "Everything can be a weapon." The foreword, written by Borrell, starts with, "Europe is in danger." Another example, and I quote specifically the report, is talking about the EU's environment, that the EU is surrounded by instability and conflicts. We face a dangerous mix of armed aggression, illegal annexation, fragile states, revisionist powers, and authoritarian regimes. This environment is a breeding ground for multiple threats to European security, from terrorism, violent extremism, organized crime, to hybrid conflicts, arms proliferation, and irregular migration. The text goes on and on. It talks repetitively about hybrid threats, bipolar competition, expanding great powers, zero-sum logics, etc. The report warns the EU. The new strategic landscape requires us to act with a far greater sense of urgency and determination than the one we use. The moment for decisive steps is now. The cost of inaction or business as usual is real. So these are just some examples that I underlined. My observation that I would like to share with you all is that while this threat analysis is very important to cohere the European Union, the European foreign policy, to share a common vision, to become more joined up, it is at the same time a dangerous one for two reasons. First, because there is nothing unique or nothing distinct in framing the world as a threat to itself. It is a very Cold War style type of a rhetoric. And the EU promised at the end of the Cold War to be another type of player, to redefine norms, to rule by example. Now its rhetoric is becoming a bit more like any other state. To put it simple, norms united Europe at the end of the Cold War, and today it seems to be fear, the fear of someone threatening us. And second, the second problem I see as a potential problem is that zero-sum logics, of course, do not end up well. They always start by saying that the other is the one that threatens us, that's why we need to protect ourselves or we need to defend, but then the other reacts too, and that's, the threats escalate. So there is a problem in overreacting or in framing other things as a threat that I would like to highlight here. There is a problem in suspecting all the time or framing a humanitarian crisis as a threat to the European Union. So that was my reflection. Thank you.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul, because also brings it to very timely and relevant discussion on the latest initiative on the strategic compass. And I mean, following up the discussion and taking into account many of the things that have been said, I think that one important aspect that we need to highlight is that the EU in general is quite good at reading the world out there when it comes to the state of global affairs, or when it comes to the threats that emanate from that state of global affairs. And that the EU has been performing relatively well. I mean, in 2003, and I think it was Christy who was saying, well, those were good old times where, I mean, the tide was in Europe's favor, in a sense that, of course, it was projecting a way of understanding the world in the same image as the EU was conceiving itself, right? Surrendering of sovereignty, trying to build a rules-based order on the basis of international cooperation and international norms. The EU was actually starting to develop strong capabilities, both internal and external. It was the time when some ESDP at the time missions were already in motion. So it projected a different way of understanding international politics than what the US was doing in Iraq, what the US was doing even in Afghanistan. It was complementing those ways, but in a different mindset. Also internally, you had the Euro put in force, you had Schengen fully operational, you were discussing the European Constitution at the time. So the tide was in our favor. Huh? So, and thus the EU did something quite good, which was saying, okay, this is what we are doing internally. This is what the world requires from the EU. I will adopt a strategy that basically puts forward this way, this governance, or this way of understanding global governance in the same image as I am understanding European governance, and hoping that then others will emulate what we are doing ourselves. And this is quite, for those times, it's quite good in a sense, and then normative power and all the discussions that follow, trying to put a convincing way to explain what the EU was doing, because at the end of the day it was doing something quite uncommon. It was building a foreign policy on bases that were not part of the core components of what foreign policy is meant to be, based on sovereignty and state sovereignty and state capabilities. So the EU did quite well. And now it's actually, and Paul was mentioning that, it's actually, and Ricardo and everyone mentioned that, is doing it quite well again. I mean, saying the world is much more problematic, the world is contested, the world is complex, is connected. So we need to adapt to this. Multipolar, it's a global order in the making. It's a truly global order in the sense that we have new powers competing, and there are also hybrid threats, and there are also instability in the neighborhood, and all that is quite well part of the EU global strategy, and it's quite part of the EU's language. And when I say EU's language, I mean Brussels language, but also member states language, right? So again, it's reading the world quite accurately, and the global strategy does so. But then, that's a big then, the problem comes in operationalizing what you say you need to do, and the instruments that you have at your disposal to act upon this good reading and this of the global environment and the threats that emanate from that. And it's not for a lack of imagination, or it's not for a lack of possibilities when it comes to designing policies and capabilities. Battle groups have been there. Today's Borrell's proposal on the rapid reaction force, it's also a good way to think about what should we do when Afghanistan comes and when problems emanate and we are not able to act. So I wouldn't say that it's not even that the tools are not there, or that the imagination for having the good tools is not there. You have what you have, but the EU is good at saying, okay, these are my limitations, this is what I can do. The problem is action. I mean, the problem is operationalization of those tools. We know about the battle groups, and I'm very sorry to say we will probably come up with a similar discussion when it comes to the reaction force. That it will eventually end up with the willingness to do so and the operationalization of this willingness in specific areas. This is the first problem. But the second problem, and I think it's even more important than this one, is the language that is associated with being a global geopolitical actor, speaking the language of power, and being able to be a geopolitical commission. Because that is, at the end of the day, raising the expectations. I mean, you want to adapt to this world, but you are doing that with very limited tools and the operationalization of those tools. And the gap, I'm afraid, is getting wider and wider because the stakes are higher, our intentions are higher, our capabilities remain the same, or at least they are transformed in a way that is still punching very much below our supposed weight, right? So in both these two dimensions, and this is only just to kickstart the discussion now, I think is where the actual problems lie, and I'm not discovering anything new. I mean, this is something that has been said on multiple occasions, and it's again the same problem. But since it is the same problem, we're still caught in the same discussions and in the same narrative when it comes to the different forms that we give to these realities, huh? The rapid reaction force, or the strategic compass, or the battle groups before that, and the needs that we have today. So I don't know what's the way out of this. Well, I mean, in an ideal world, yes, we know the European army, it's the ideal goal, but that will never happen, right? I mean, we all agree that will never happen because of what Ricardo was putting forward as the initial standing point from joint as well, and the threefold problems that are identified in terms of multipolar competition, instability, and internal division. So, where to go from here? I mean, right. This is I think the relevant question that we need to ask ourselves, and the answer might be lower expectations or amplify capabilities and actually operationalize capabilities, right? But it's either or, I would say. I mean, it's either we play by the rules of what we can do and by the tools that we can have, or we basically develop new ways for operationalizing the tools that are in agreement with the expectations that we raise. So I don't know. Just some reaction to this, and very much looking forward to the discussion. We have more than half an hour left for the discussion. I will take. I would perhaps give the opportunity if there are other people who want to intervene at this point before coming back to the speakers and people who have already spoken. But is there anyone who would like to make the first difficult question or comment that in our audience, who's or our researchers of the project? Mariana.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for great interventions, very interesting, and you talk about quite different topics, even if we all talk about EU foreign policy, of course. So I think I will have a couple of questions that go to all the panelists. I agree with all of you saying that this is about much more than capabilities, of course, which we also agree. But I have one question regarding the kind of internal contestation in the EU, and I very much agree that one of the core challenges the EU is facing is linked to internal contestation. because, I mean, the EU is a voluntary project. If you have member states who decide not to follow the rules and the values, I mean, the whole kind of basis of the project falls apart. So it's super interesting. It's actually existential in a sense. But I was wondering if this is really that broad of a problem, or if it's, are we really talking about EU contestation, European contestation, or are we really talking about contestation from certain governments in the European Union? Because it seems to me that the European Union is more popular than ever, and foreign policy is super popular amongst the population, and the corona crisis has increased the support amongst the European population. So it doesn't solve the problem, of course, because if it's about a couple of governments, it doesn't really help to punish the population in these countries. But I was wondering if EU contestation is that big of a problem beyond certain countries without undermining that kind of key challenge that these countries pose, of course, due to the challenging the very core rules of the EU. So how do we deal with that? I mean, just it's a difficult question, but one wants to punish these countries, but at the same time you punish the population. So it's if maybe the panel wants to comment. I also want to add, like to hear more on transatlantic relations, because now also the United States agreed that the EU will have to take on more responsibility for its own security, and the United States might not even be that interested in Russia anymore. It's a regional power, it's not a global threat. So one of the key questions that the EU will have to face is kind of finding the balance between its interest in trade relations with China, climate negotiations, cooperation with China on the one hand, and the US becoming more and more realist in a sense, so it will demand loyalty from the European Union. So this is, I'm not sure if it's possible to talk about being joined up if we don't also look at these kind of broader questions, and I will be very, sorry. I loved also Zachary's comments, that you kind of did this broader, and it's, I agree that maybe we don't have the necessary concepts to think about, which is super interesting and something we should pick up. And if there is a new order emerging, then of course the EU has maybe it has an even particularly important role to play since it's a different actor. But you also said that the EU needs then to find a way of decoupling the two pillars of the liberal and the rules-based multilateral order. But I was wondering if, is this necessarily so? Because many IR issues are actually playing out, or many of the big conflicts and challenges are playing out in the areas that are the least regulated also. If you look at space, cyber, the high seas, these areas are the least regulated areas of the world, and those are the areas that are in the making, in a sense. And these are also areas where the EU is very active. It has a cyber strategy, it has a maritime strategy, it has an Arctic strategy, climate policies. So maybe the EU is already trying to redoing the not redoing, but making a new international system by being so active in these areas. And if it is, does it necessarily need to decouple these two things? Because, I mean, a climate policy is per definition rights-based, and the global commons in themselves, they are global common goods, so they belong to everyone in a sense. So I have some more questions, but I will stop for now.
Thanks. I'll gather more if there are more comments or questions, and you'll have the opportunity to reply. Anyone else would like to? Yeah, Dylan, please.
Hi, I can take this off now, yeah? I'm Dylan Carlson from CEPS. I wanted to come back to the point that Pernilla made and the last point that you made as the moderator, and come back to the strategic compass that Paul brought up. One of the key flagship initiatives, of course, is this rapid deployment capacity that should be operationalized according to more flexible decision-making and using coalitions of the willing, constructive abstention and whatnot. And this seems to be a way of encouraging differentiated integration through the EU treaty framework. Pernilla, you brought up several examples of differentiated integration outside of this EU treaty framework. And I think this kind of, in my mind, begs the question, the EU has trouble coming together and you know, operationalizing its CSDP. It, at the same time, has an issue of credibility, and if EU member states decide to act together outside of the EU framework, then they do so in their name. They don't do so in the name of the EU. So how do you convince EU member states to bring their action into the EU framework? And I think that's the key issue. I mean, France and Germany can have their own bilateral, you know, mutual defense clause, but how do you convince them to decide instead of, you know, engaging operationally together, but in a coalition of the willing? How do you convince them to do so through the EU? Thank you.
This is very relevant as well, and differentiated integration and effects on EU foreign policy. Also, a project that we EU idea was or is still unfolding, but on EU foreign policy, we're working very much along those lines, and very relevant input as well. And anyone else at this point? Otherwise, I'll come back to the panel. No. Same order. Ricardo, you want to? Yeah.
Usually you don't need to convince member states, I'm starting from your question, Dylan, to bring their own foreign policy onto the EU stage. They try to do that all the time, precisely because if they manage to do that, their foreign policy action will have a magnifying impact. And there is the rub, because other member states do not want to be drawn into that action on terms that they were not, they did not define in the first term, terms defined by others. So that's one of the problems you have, especially in crisis management, because the place where the bargaining and negotiation and adaptation process between member states happens ex post rather than ex ante, and therefore you have member states with deeply held positions which are already well entrenched and which they are therefore disincentivized to abandon. And the other member states may not be as interested in joining that initiative to push the other member states to change their position, and therefore they just opt to stay out, and in order not to be involved, they block progress at the EU level, or just agree to minimal steps, and you get to common denominator based positions. That's how the dynamics works, and there is no way out of this. The only definitive response to this kind of problems, is institutional. You have to integrate. That's not impossible, but it is becoming increasingly difficult, and it's not something that you can present as a solution to specific crises. It's a much broader strategic decision member states have to take, and they have been quite reluctant to integrate further, although some steps at the policy level have been possible, and the current existing treaty does allow for some flexibility in order to bring integration forward in a differentiated way, with not all member states involved in certain specific sectors, defense, but clearly these are suboptimal solutions to the problem you mentioned, which is a structural problem. The other potential solution is the development of a common strategic culture, which creates by itself pathways along which member states increasingly see strategically things in terms compatible with one another. And because of the great complexity of Europe's geography and incredibly variegated nature of its history, this process, I don't know if it is possible to ever bring it to a conclusion, but we basically, I mean, the Western European states started earlier. Now we have a much larger European Union, and that has involved other member states to bring their own culture, their own sensitivities. I mean, what Christy said about the Baltic states is trivial perhaps, but is no less true. And it is something that I have to repeat every time I speak to someone who isn't so much aware of the geopolitical predicament, especially now, of Estonia or Latvia or even Lithuania and Poland. Again, ad hoc solutions when it comes to specific crises is the only thing you can do. And in order to have that, you need to have some diplomatic creativity, and you need to have some ability to take the initiative. And with that, I get to the question of how to factor in the transatlantic relationship. The transatlantic relationship is really a complicating factor here, precisely because it is so important, even existential, for, I would say, for all member states. Although, of course, for some, this existential nature of the transatlantic relationship is evident. Estonia, again. For Portugal, it's not that evident, but still, I would say that it might be existential even for the Portuguese. So one way to, again, you need diplomatic creativity. You need to make the transatlantic relationship a fact that at the same time empowers a push towards greater European unity, facilitates that, and binds the United States to be more supportive of whatever European efforts you are thinking about. There is one instance in which the Europeans did exactly that, the Iran case. They started off against the wishes of the United States with great caution not to break ranks entirely from the United States. This was in the early 2000s. They used European unity in order to increase their leverage vis-à-vis the United States, but with the ultimate goal of bringing the United States into the diplomatic loop with Iran, which is exactly what happened in 2006 first, and then 2009 when Obama became president more extensively. Now, if you talk to an American expert, not necessarily an American diplomat, but an American expert, he or she will tell you, look, the US approach towards Iran has changed because there were changes in the White House. Bush was against negotiation or only reluctant to engage in negotiations with Iran. Obama was very much willing. Trump was totally opposed. Now Biden is again. So it's all about the personal orientation or the political color of the president in power. But that's not what actually happened, because when Obama decided to engage the Iranians in actual negotiations over the nuclear program, he did not have to start from scratch. There had been a process, a diplomatic process in which the Europeans had managed to involve the Americans that had paved the way and legitimized, even in the US eyes, the very proposition of negotiating with Iran. And the Europeans did something similar in a much worsened situation during the Trump years. Can you do the trick all the time? No. Especially when it comes to defense. But here I guess that we all need, especially the Atlanticist-oriented experts in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Germany and in Northern Europe, needs to make a honest effort at telling themselves what this strategic autonomy or geopolitical commission or power Europe or European sovereignty actually means. And they have to come clean on where exactly that would undermine the transatlantic relationship, rather than instead making the transatlantic relationship perhaps a bit more balanced and therefore more relevant to the United States itself. Clearly, the problem is that the US itself they don't say that. They say we don't want strategic autonomy to weaken NATO. But if strategic autonomy eventually results in greater military capabilities of the Europeans, then NATO in theory should be strengthened, because the membership, there is a big overlap in membership between the EU and NATO. When the Americans say that, what they actually mean is, if the Europeans become more strategically autonomous, that means that they can do things we do not want them to do. And we don't want that to happen. And here, this is really a political challenge, because you have to convince the Americans that having a less dependent Europe is actually going to go to their advantage. Because whatever disagreements the Europeans may have with the Americans, they will never turn into something really damaging for the Americans. The worst you can get is that France and Germany won't go to war to Iraq with you. But that's not really something that altered the strategic relationship between the parties, and that's not something that really, really harmed the Americans. So, but again, this is really difficult to do because the American domestic politics is not very flexible, and it is extremely reluctant to accept anything that even smells of a loss of power. So the only thing I can say is that we have to start doing some more serious analytical business here in Europe, and we have to get out from this inferiority mindset and look at the United States and tell them, look, even Estonia can want a stronger European Union, because a stronger European Union is basically going to mean a stronger transatlantic relationship, even though on certain issues the Europeans will be more capable of saying no to the Americans. But yeah, again, it's not easy, but it's not impossible. It's not structurally impossible.
Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, let me move on. Christy, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you, everyone. There are so many issues I would like to react on. But perhaps I start from where Ricardo stopped. The strategic autonomy. The way I see it, I don't think there is lack of realism and honesty in the way we, let's say, in the Central and Eastern part of Europe, talk about it. If you look at factually what are the capabilities of Europe, not even speaking about the EU, but speaking about Europe, what they are today, what they are going to be tomorrow, what they are going to be in 3 years, they are insufficient for us to be able to take care of our security. And that's the core problem with this concept of strategic autonomy, that it's not credible in our eyes. How can you speak about autonomy if you're actually not able to address an existential concern of some European states as Europeans? And it's not about being against developing these capabilities, but it's a very slow and long process. And it's kind of premature to talk about autonomy. It's an aspiration, it's not a reality. Europe is not autonomous today. And the way some member states have been talking about it has made then countries in our region even more suspicious. And when it comes to the transatlantic relationship, of course it has been agreed at the EU level and repeated over and over again that the EU's efforts to strengthen its strategic autonomy is absolutely not about undermining the transatlantic relationship or NATO, etc. And yet when we look closer at national rhetoric in different member states, there are differences. And you can't say it's not existing in the European discussions, this idea that Europe should actually be more autonomous from the US. So we have different views on this very important strategic issue. And one crucial question when it comes to Europe's strengthening of strategic autonomy and strengthening of capabilities, one big question mark is Germany. And it's really interesting to see now the fresh coalition agreement that just came out, that it's, I think, quite promising. I mean, it's at the same time very strong in its commitment to Europe and to act through Europe, but it's also quite strong on defense. And I think Germany is kind of growing to this realization that if Europe really wants to become less dependent, then Germany is the one country that actually needs to do a lot, and especially in the northern part of Europe and northeastern part of Europe. It's not just about, providing a service to the smaller countries in the region, but it's actually in Germany's own interest to take stronger responsibility for regional security, because Germany is the country that, after all, has benefited so much economically and politically from peaceful and stable Europe. Very shortly, this dimension of liberal versus illiberal, it has been kind of running through the different presentations, and we really are at this critical juncture of, how to find new answers to this puzzle. And Zachary was making some really interesting points and kind of, to some extent, overlapping with mine. It's a very important point that the multipolar competition is not just in a kind of realist sense of power against power, but it has this dimension of values and norms. And I'm not very optimistic about this possibility to actually separate rules from liberalism. To some extent, yes, and that's something we need to try to do, and especially when it comes to security, try to strengthen norms that are shared by all states, like security norms globally. And we actually have a set of norms, very beautiful norms defined in the UN context, but they are just being constantly violated. But then when it goes to the new sectors, digital and cyber, there is a very strong tension between liberal and illiberal approaches there. And all this work that Europeans have been doing on norm building in the field of cyber and digital, and Estonia has been very active there, it really is a struggle because we are facing the big authoritarian powers whose understanding about how to regulate the cyberspace and the digital space is just totally different from ours. So it's very hard to find a common ground. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we have only 10 minutes, so I will ask the rest of the speakers to be quite short, if possible. Pernille?
We'll try. I will start also follow up on Kristi with strategic autonomy and what we are talking about here. And I agree if we define strategic autonomy and the capacity to be strategic autonomous in very specific defense terms, of course, and also in very traditional kind of territorial threat terms, of course, the EU and Europe as such do not have the capacities really to deter a kind of huge military invasion, if that's what we talk about. But what are the threats that we are actually facing today, I mean, in the East and elsewhere? There's not that kind of, the threats that we see at the Polish border is more realistic threat. You have the hybrid scenarios of different kinds.
Military power is always behind the hybrid threat.
Sorry?
Military power.
Yeah, of course, but I just wonder if that is the most realistic. And of course, we need to have that kind of a deterrence. But I think that often in this discussion, I think that we underestimate what the what Europe actually can do and what kind of capacities we are talking about when we are talking about strategic autonomy. So I think that we are, in Europe, closer to strategic autonomy than we often hear. But of course, the whole process of what's happening on defense capabilities is necessary in order to boost the real defense capabilities. But I think we can handle quite a lot, and more than often is the case. And then to Dylan's question about European initiative versus what's going on in the EU. And I think this is not an either-or. The problem is that what is happening within the EU and CSDP and PESCO and strategic concept and all that, this is important for long-term defense capability development. But the challenge is still, as we have heard here and as Paul mentioned, is the decision-making. So it is that the EU is not capable of taking a decision and act fast enough if you have a real crisis. And that's why you need these other initiatives in order to, and in the long term, hopefully, this will, of course, ideally, you should have everything happening inside the EU, but I don't think it will happen in a long time that the EU actually will manage to act rapidly. I mean, you know, when France decided to intervene in Mali, and we can discuss if that was a good idea or not, but at least they did, and they had to act fast, and of course they couldn't go through the EU, and of course the French are very good at acting very, very fast. But I think that we need, if we are faced with a real crisis that really threatens the EU, we need to have possibilities, a little bit more pragmatic solution and flexible formats, and see these as real possibilities. And see this, how they are interlinked and linked together. And so to Mariana, do I have time? Just very, very short. Internal contestation, I think it's a real problem, because I think it's if we accept this, this could kind of become, it sends the wrong signal, and the EU, I'm saying we here, and we are not part of the EU, but I feel like I'm part of the EU. I think that it sends the wrong signal, and it could also be a slippery slope. I mean, how could the EU be a credible actor promoting norms and values if the EU is not capable of kind of preserving these?
But just meant if it's a European problem, or if it's kind of something that, I agree that it's a super serious problem and it's kind of the existential problem maybe. But if it's maybe only about Poland and Hungary and maybe Slovenia, or if it's about the rest of the EU as well.
I think it's manageable now, but it could become a greater problem. And last thing on transatlantic relation, just one sentence. I mean, transatlantic relation, I think we all agree that it's super important to keep US engaged in Europe. But what if the US is not interested? And what if the US have other interests than Europe? And even we can try to do it, and we will probably try to find a way to it, but not at any cost. So that, I think that is super important to have in mind. I mean, this is a debate that we have in Norway all the time. We need the US for our security. Yes, we need, but what if the US is not, if the security guarantee is not there? We need to have an alternative strategy. We need to have a plan B. Yeah. Thanks.
Adam, can you do 1 minute? Or you can skip your turn if you don't want to.
Now maybe only something on Germany, no, because I heard some positive comments. I don't see really the will in Germany to change something in foreign and security policy. Which party should do it? The Social Democrats were always more Russia-friendly than the Christian Democrats. The Greens, you know, where they come from, right? Usually a pacifist party, which does not mean that between 1998 and 2005, under Schröder, right, the first military intervention happened, and the liberals are not really included. I don't see any will of the German society, of German people, to talk about security issues, really, or building out a common European army. I think there's coalition now, what we saw these days in this preliminary coalition talks, and what's right now on paper. I don't think that will happen. Yeah. Thanks.
Zachary.
I'll be very brief and I'll just answer Mariana's question, which was very thought-provoking, and thank you. Maybe I should just clarify what I meant to say, which is that the EU needs to manage at the global level the balance between, or rather the decoupling between liberalism and rules-based practices, which is currently underway, by coming up with a new mixture between liberalism and rules-based emphasis within its own policy. So it doesn't mean that it has to abandon one entirely for the other. There is a decoupling between the two that is underway globally, and the question is, how does the EU respond by adjusting its own priorities? And we're seeing it already in EU foreign policy in the post-Ukraine context, right? You know, in which the EU is much more cautious now about going in and promoting democratic revolutions, you know, in countries where, I'm not saying there are no problems and nothing's going on, but perhaps things didn't have to unfold precisely the way they did in 2014. So that's what I meant to say. So on your argument that, you know, in some of these areas, the Arctic, space, high seas, environment, cyber, these are areas that are where order or ordering regimes are to a certain extent lacking right now and are still to be done. I would add an additional area, which would be Central Asia, right, which is at the periphery, effectively, of the liberal international order, which has relied on American maritime power, right? And the EU in that realm has adopted a very different approach, right? And the areas that you listed, you know, you're saying basically, let the EU punch with full force. Let it punch with its liberalism and let it punch with its rules-based practices. But in Central Asia, where we may be looking at the advent of some sort of thin order, and the EU has been a little bit more cautious about its involvement there, I think it's a very interesting avenue for research, perhaps, to look at, you know, how the differences in EU approach to that region versus the regions you listed or areas you listed unfolds ultimately over the years to come, and which approach effectively, you know, is a more satisfactory one for the EU to adopt across the board, if such a thing can indeed be determined. So I think that's an interesting thing.
Okay.
Last point, because I know we're out of time. Very last point on what you said regarding internal contestation, and this, I think, wraps up the conversation to a certain extent, which is that, you know, we view the EU over recent years and decades as having become thicker, more integrated, right? There's a monetary union now, it's a foreign policy actor now, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is it's got deeper rules because it has become a thinner internal actor, right? There's more cultural diversity within the EU. Cultural diversity, at least so far, has bred thinness. And when you have thinness, you need formal rules to govern relations rather than just relying on cultural homogeneity that you already had. This happens domestically as well, right? And in the Anglo-Saxon world, liberalism used to be a complement to the established cultural homogeneity within Anglo-Saxon countries. Now, in a multicultural era, it's about celebrating diversity. It's about celebrating what makes you different rather than, you know, mobilizing people behind what you have in common. So the difficulty that the EU faces right now is its ambition is it wants to do more in the world, and it thinks it can do more because it's become a more integrated foreign policy actor. But the reality is it's a thinner actor now than it used to be. And that's something that we need to keep in mind as well and think about how to wrestle with that fundamental tension.
That was interesting. Paul,
30
seconds.
Give me
Sorry, you're from CIDOB, so you have 30 seconds.
The tension between the strategic autonomy and the transatlantic relationship that Mariana put on the table, I think is part of the broader problem I tried to express, which is that the EU foreign policy is becoming too inward-looking, too defensive. And don't get me wrong, it's very important, the strategic autonomy, the strategic compass is very important for health, for all sorts of policy fields. But it's about getting the balance right between partnering, strengthening partnerships, and getting too defensive and wanting everything for you. And I give you an example that I think proves me right, which is that I remember 2018, I went to Rome, invited by Ricardo and his colleagues, and Natalie Tocci was presenting on the global strategy and the reason, the logic behind it. And the idea of resilience was very strong. Resilience, the EU should strengthen resilience to the east and south, because if the neighborhood becomes adaptive to crisis, it will become, in the end, very useful for the EU. Today, in the strategic compass, resilience appears 35 times. 32 of them, it's about our resilience. And the 3 remaining is about our partners' resilience. So it's no longer about the resilience of the neighborhood or of the crisis zones, but our resilience. So to finish with a quote by Zach, without resilience or without cultural diplomacies, without this opening up to the world, the EU will not shape the current order, will not play a role in the creation of the new order, as Zach would say. So that would be my point. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. An interesting point about the resilience. No, I wanted to finish here because we're 1 minute late, but also to finish on a positive note, and that is that, I mean, I think that the strategic compass itself was meant as a way to build or start building this shared strategic culture for the EU through member states buy-in, and that is something that the global strategy perhaps lacked more when compared to the strategic compass policy-making process. So that is a good thing. And also the fact that the events out there are speaking in favor of this joint strategic culture, because if you look at two areas, migration and energy, well, the challenges for Spain and Ceuta and the challenges for Poland and Belarus are quite similar when it comes to the traditional division between East and South concerns. Well, it so happens that the concerns are similar now. And also on energy, the challenges from Spain coming from Algeria are similar to the challenges that that Germany is facing vis-a-vis Russia, right? So at least if you have some shared understanding that the challenges are the same East and South, well, perhaps you can start, that's the first step, but you can start building this shared or joint strategic culture that I think that at the very end is what keeps us Europeans divided. So thank you very much for being here and for traveling to Barcelona. Warm welcome to CIDOB, and tomorrow we have our internal meeting, so very good. See you tomorrow.